Hello, welcome to this Lit in 5 reading on William Blake's poem The Sick Rose. This video will explore multiple interpretations, AO5, interwoven with contextual analysis, AO3, and as ever incorporating lots of close analysis of literary techniques, AO1/2. If you like the video, please add your likes, please subscribe to the channel, please add some comments underneath and tell your friends. Okay, William Blake's The Sick Rose. Now, I normally just launch into lots of AO1/2 annotation, lots of squiggles, lots of terminology, lots of analysis and explanations. However, on the next slides, this time we're going to have a little tour of the rose garden instead, looking at some possible interpretations. Why? Well, although this is just an 8-line lyric poem, it's a tricky little beast. But it's an amazing, brilliant poem, partially because it's a tricky little beast. So, on to the next slide. Okay, so let's start our analysis of these 6 interpretative positions. Now, everything we do here hinges on the interpretation or the analysis of these 2 key symbols, these 2 moments of symbolism. One being the rose. You'll see comments in red in a moment relating to that, and the invisible worm, which you'll see comments in green text in a moment. So, as I hope we know, symbolism, objects which stand in for a bigger, wider, sometimes more abstract idea. So there's our first and key bit of AO1/2. The first 3 of these 6 are going to be relationship-based interpretations. So there's another video which, once we've gone through the Romantic poets, considers what kind and type of questions may come up, things which unite all the poems, themes or concepts that run across all of them, and then we can start to think about which poems would be best suited to those questions, but that's a different video for now. So let's jump straight to our first interpretation, which is this one here. Considering the invisible worm as a jilted or rejected lover, or another lover, in terms of a third party, we'll come to that in a moment, and the red rose as a love that the worm wanted to have but has not been successful. And this 8-line poem perhaps deals with the aftermath or the bitter repercussions of being rejected and jilted. We've also got the opportunity to consider the rose as a relationship or a marriage, maybe coming from the word bed, which could be hinting towards a marital bed, a relationship that the red rose is already in, but our vengeful, bitter and destructive worm wants to go and spoil. So in this sense, we're considering the invisible worm as someone, a he, because the worm is gendered in the second stanza, who has been spurned or rejected. They've declared their intentions or their love or their desire towards the rose previously. They're beloved. It's a love they've tried to have, or a relationship they've tried to have previously. And because of rejection, we have an extremely bitter, nasty, vindictive, and a word I'm going to use a lot later on, a malicious figure having been rejected. It's always interesting in poetry, certainly things like sonnets or a lot of poetry, you tend to have these told from a male perspective, although in The Sick Rose we don't have a named observer. It's not first person, it's third person, and remains rather detached from the events. These poems then, you often see the female beloved presented in this or depicted in this as what is called the cruel mistress, a convention which sort of goes back to the father of the sonnet really, Petrarch. And she's a cruel mistress because, oh my goodness, she has not returned his affections. How dare she? Or she's not reciprocated or given back the love and affection shown towards her. What if he's horrible? What if he's monstrous? What if he's a horrible monster? So you must always be aware of that bias, I think, in poetry, certainly some older poetry. We don't get to hear from, or tend to hear from, the female perspective. You do with female poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning or Emily Bronte, who we study later, or in the Victorian period, the brilliant Christina Rossetti. But that's worth bearing in mind. And sadly is not for now. That's for a different video, perhaps. So this first interpretation tends to lend to a pretty dark reading of the poem, or a dark reading of doomed or failed love. The stuff in brackets, another lover, as I've mentioned previously, there's maybe the opportunity to see the bed as a marriage bed. So the rose is in a relationship or marriage, perhaps, already, and our invisible worm is extremely unhappy about that, to the point where he wants to destroy the love the rose currently has. So you've maybe got the idea of a third party there, where the worm is of the mind that it should be me you're with, you would be better with me, you would be happier, I deserve you, what are you doing with that silly salad eater over there, or what have you, I don't know. So there could be that interpretation as well. There's number one. Number two, in our interpretative possibilities, we're going to be looking at a slightly more philosophical interpretation here. Still relationship based though. We're looking at excessive sexual desire. Please remember, and this is a good thing for AO3 context, that Blake is writing these poems as part of his collection of the Songs of Innocence and the Songs of Experience, where he talks about, or wants to explore, and this is flashing up for you now, this quote, the two contrary states of the human soul. And there's also an interesting little quote there about contraries in human experience. That's also useful for AO3 for you. So, in this approach, desire is good. Desire is natural. It's joyful to act upon in one side of the scales. But to be excessively ruled by desire, or sexual desire, or have that dominate, is an imbalance. So perhaps part of Blake's aims in writing the Songs of Innocence and Experience is to teach us to strive for, or the importance of, balance and harmony between those two contrary states. So with this second reading, we're maybe seeing how, if desire is excessive, or sexual desire is excessive and imbalanced, those scales are tipping towards destruction. Or, here's an alternative approach, this is maybe just exploring the consequences of acting upon sexual desire. What does that do towards your love and affection? As and when things are taken to the stage of physical intimacy. So in this second sense, we're maybe not seeing the darkness of the earlier reading, but I'm going to raise the idea of an important paradox, or an ambivalence the worm might be having in terms of taking things to the stage of physical intimacy. But more of that later. Number three, interpretation number three here. So we're going to look at the idea, this is a reading I'm less convinced by, but I'll raise it, you can consider it and evaluate it and see if you agree, partially agree, disagree. That's part of what we do in lit with this interpretation. So we're seeing the invisible worm as being a metaphor for plaguing or lurking thoughts and feelings within love. So this is a reading which might consider some of the natural difficulties or problems within love or a relationship, Maybe you can relate. Hopefully you can't, but maybe you can. So, for example, here I've got things in brackets like jealousy or doubts or fidelity, which is just another word for faithfulness, and could even be doubts towards faithfulness. Can you be sure your lover is true to you? Are they committed in mind and soul as well as body? This reading, I guess, is inspired by that famous quotation from Othello, that metaphor Shakespeare uses for jealousy, where he describes jealousy as the green-eyed monster. So, those doubts and suspicions, false of course, in relation to that play. Part of the tragedy of that play is that Iago plants in Othello's mind, puts these thoughts in, which worm or burrow or dig into Othello's mind, that his very faithful wife, Desdemona, is unfaithful. And so, again, another part of the tragedy is that Othello's mind unravels to the point where he believes Iago and puts a pillow over his wife's face and suffocates her to death on the say-so of his good friend, irony alert, Iago. Oh, spoilers. Sorry about that. So, we're looking at, with this reading and of Blake's Sick Rose, the effects of what these poisonous thoughts can do to a love or a relationship or a marriage. Interpretations 4, 5 and 6. So, we're getting away from now our relationship readings, and instead we're going to consider things that are more typical of socio-historical and theological interpretations. Ooh! Okay, so with number 4, we're going to be doing an allegorical reading. Definition of allegory is flashing up for you now. This is where a supposedly simple story actually contains a much deeper, usually, but not always, religious interpretation. Can be political, of course. You can have political allegory. So, we're definitely into allegory when we also look at the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Seeing that on a level that's much deeper than the surface level of a guy in a boat. So, here, we're looking at something deeper than a worm flying into a rose and killing the rose. So what that gets us into is the rose as the Garden of Eden, and the worm being the serpent, Satan, in a serpentine form in that garden. You might be wondering, how on earth are you getting to serpent from worm? Well, that's a fair question, but apparently in the Bible of the Christian faith, worms are often used as a synonym or a replacement for serpent. So this gets us into seeing the rose as what critics and academics, which will do you no harm at all to use similar language in your essays, should you write on this, as a pre or post lapsarian world of man / paradise. In there you can hear the word lapse. So if something has lapsed, it has deteriorated. So we have that idea of paradise being taken away from us, and we are then evicted or banished into the world of man. So pre-lapsarian, Adam and Eve, mankind, are in paradise. Everything is on tap. There is endless custard. There's a version of Netflix that just continuously plays and doesn't ask, are you still watching? See? Heaven, bliss, paradise. But due to the fall of man, we give into temptation and we're banished from there, and we're in a post-lapsarian world, destined to live in the world of man and have to walk forever in Middlesbrough. Ooh, a fate worse than death. Reading position number 5. So we're definitely into a very strongly historical reading here. And what I want us to consider now is, again, this is useful for AO3, William Blake being strongly anti-monarchical. There's a quote flashing up from his poem London, which we also study, and a little comment alongside that to help reinforce that point of view. Blake is a Republican. He is no fan of the monarchy at all, or even the idea of monarchy, I guess, which has the idea of those who are vastly wealthy and privileged, living above those they rule, whilst there's enormous poverty in the world. There's an image flashing up for you in a moment of the French Revolution, not an actual photograph. No one had cameras at the time. If it didn't have a photograph, it didn't happen. No, we don't believe that. Okay, so the French Revolution is occurring whilst Blake is writing the poem, absolutely. And it's also something that's very influential on other Romantic writers as well, such as Wordsworth. Although this revolution is in France, that event definitely sends waves and has a ripple effect across all of Europe. And so other countries and their monarchies are getting a little bit nervous around this time as a revolutionary fervour appears. All fervour means is heat or ideas that have this kind of explosive principle underneath them. So yeah, very, very twitchy. Don't put that in your essay. When people start to question, well, do we need the monarchy? The French have shown the way, so should we maybe get rid of ours and have greater democracy in how we run our lives and our country? So from France, these ideas absolutely ripple into England. So in terms of the rose, revolutionary fervour is being infiltrated and penetrated by the invisible worm of revolutionary ideas. This is maybe a slightly different reading position here. The ones we've considered so far are maybe rather sad or have a sense of lament about what the worm, does to the rose. This might be slightly opposite in the sense that Mr. Blake is, ooh, in you come, revolutionary ideas. Come in and happily destroy this rose, and let's get life to a greater sense of democracy and fairness. But more of that when we get into the individual reading later. And finally, on our little whistle-stop tour of interpretative possibilities, we're going to consider this in terms of another AO3 matter here, the Industrial Revolution, which is absolutely thriving when our Romantic poets are writing. I put a question mark there. It's maybe a dubious reading, but as ever, it's one to consider, one to interpret, dismiss, challenge, evaluate. Readings are not set in stone. Even stone crumbles. If you read Shelley's Ozymandias, you'll understand that too. It's entirely up to you. Okay, so this Industrial Revolution idea. So we're seeing swathes of God's green earth being destroyed here, torn down, dug up to build factories and mills, which billow out pollution. So ruining even more of nature, which, as we know by now, is vastly important to Romantic poets. It's their teacher, it's their muse and inspiration for their poetry, it's evidence of God in the universe, ideas of pantheism, etc., and many more. So the Industrial Revolution is absolutely a dagger in the heart of the Romantics, purely in the sense that nature is being destroyed for exploitation and profit. Now, you might be thinking, what's an invisible worm got to do with the Industrial Revolution? The worm is a thing of nature, so don't Romantics like that? Even though it's a worm, it's a thing of nature. How are you getting there? That's a fair question, and maybe why this reading is slightly more dubious. But I think we should look at the invisible worm as something representative of capitalism, or avarice, or a greed that industrialists and capitalists have for the purpose of profit. So this invisible worm is destroying nature, all in the name of profit, and also destroying mankind as well. There's a quote here from Blake's Jerusalem I'm going to flash up now, which ends up as a very patriotic hymn in this country. And there you can see dark satanic mills. So man is worked into the ground, is exploited, and works in appalling conditions at the cost of the natural world. Okay, there's our 6 interpretative positions. We want to see how they work out, and we will do so in tremendous AO1/2 detail next. Here's the slide where I will look at metrical stress. So in other words, the rhythm, where and how the meter is used in the poem. As ever, these are open to interpretation as well, but at least it's something to work with. I'll leave this slide pretty blank, but I will be referring, when we get into further analysis later on, the significance of where some of these metrical stresses may land. Right, so first thing to note is that we have our rhyme scheme here of A, B, C, B. So, as you can see, worm and storm, it's kind of a half rhyme really, I guess. But we do have in the second stanza the rhyming of joy with destroy, which we can have some fun with some of our interpretations that we're going to make. Having a look at the metrical stress here, you will notice that we have at the start of the poem 2 lines pointing up in the air, which are 2 accented syllables. Try and think of these as the volume turned up louder on certain words in the poem. That's how I always teach it in class. Don't say that in an essay, but you're meant to hear/read these louder, if that sort of makes sense, mixing senses and metaphors and everything else. So we have here in the opening, O Rose, with a double emphasis, and we have that again a bit later on with things like found out. And another metrical stress I'll be looking at is where you have the emphasis on howling storm. So we're going to have a little play with some of these in a moment. Let's get some technical terminology here that we can show off with in essays. So when we have this double accented, that is called a spondee. Flashing up now for you. Or spondaic meter. When we have 2 unstressed, which is here, the underlined ones, the in, and we have in the, that's called an anapest, also flashing up for you. So there's some technical terminology we can show off with. In terms of the number of beats on most lines, you can see occasionally we have a mixture of 2 accented beats per lines, dimeter, or occasionally we have an example where there are 3, which is spookily trimeter. Okay, so there's all our technical lingo to show off about. Let's start mapping that onto our language analysis. So our jilted or wronged or another extramarital, if you like, lover interpretation. The first things I want to note are the following words. The adjective invisible, the place adverbial in the night, the 2 words in the second stanza found out, very interesting, and these 2 adjectives here, dark and secret. So what that shows for me is that the invisible worm wants to arrive and penetrate and invade the rose in secret. It does not want to announce its arrival. So that for me is showing that idea, that malice and that bitterness, that they're going to creep in under cover of darkness, and it's going to be quiet. There's not going to be a tip-off or a warning of its arrival, but that arrival will lead to the destruction of the rose. So we're really getting that idea of malice and bitterness here, probably or possibly caused by that idea of the rose not reciprocating or returning its affection. How dare it, she? But these are the sort of bitter actions the invisible worm feels it has been driven to now. So those words we've highlighted, we can pull them all together, and I think it's fair to say that can give us a semantic field here of something I'm going to call a semantic field of the clandestine or furtive language. So we'd use that AO2 technique to highlight if the question is suitable for it. Remember, we're always guided by the question in terms of what interpretations we use to show that malice of the invisible worm with the points we've just made earlier. With that place adverbial as well, in the night, that's clearly adding to the sense of sort of evil intent here with sinister implications. So that's reinforcing that idea of the bitterness and the vengefulness from this invisible worm which feels it has been wronged. Taking these ideas a little bit further, still with the same semantic field, it is actually possible to push that on a little bit further in terms of how we interpret it. So we have invisible worm, which flies in the night in a howling storm, which has found out thy bed of crimson joy. Looking even more closely at that language, we're starting to get the idea of something vampiric here. This poem was written before Bram Stoker publishes the novel Dracula, but obviously, you know, the idea of vampires existed in myth and folklore before Stoker releases the novel. So, yeah, we are looking at something that can be seen quite possibly, I think, as something vampiric, coming to attack and prey and feed on and then destroy the rose. So this invisible worm that has been wronged by not having affections returned is some kind of predator, a destructive parasitic predator. If you know the novel Dracula, you'll know that when he appears in the narrative, he's often heralded or introduced or foreshadowed by weather. So here in our ABCB rhyme scheme, we have the half rhyme of worm and storm, so reinforcing how this worm clearly is some kind of harbinger of destruction. It's arriving here with destructive intent. And also, of course, in the second stanza, you have your rhyme of joy and destroy. So that's lending itself to that malicious glee. Dracula is obviously a predator. So we're looking at crimson here, which obviously lends to that vampiric idea of blood and destruction. Dracula gains his pleasure out of sort of attacking and infiltrating usually virgins, not always, certainly young women, and the penetration of those with his teeth and to drain them of their blood. So there is that interpretation there, I think, in terms of how far you want to take this idea of the extent a wronged lover will go to gain revenge or act maliciously. Just building in some metrical stress analysis here as well from the previous slide. I'll write it on again here just to help, but you can refer back to that slide, of course. We have the meter landing on the assonant vowel sound in the first three letters, which means the first syllable of the word howling. So it's almost as if Blake is wanting to onomatopoeically evoke the sound of that storm, which, as I said before, heralds or foreshadows the destructive intent of this invisible worm flying in the night. So, as well as the metrical stress, we can, of course, build in the idea of pathetic fallacy there, weather indicating feeling and or mood. There's another technique we ought to tease out there and show off to the examiner about, signalling that destructive intent. Whilst we're on with metrical stress here as well, if you look at the first line of that second stanza and the words found out, again, as we mentioned previously or highlighted previously, we have the metrical stress, a spondaic metrical stress on the two words found out. So why are they possibly emphasised? Well, for me, if we tie it into that idea of malice and revenge, then we definitely have that notion of malicious glee. If something is found out by its nature or its kind of its meaning, it's suggesting that something wanted to be hidden and remain out of sight. So I think the invisible worm with that spondaic stress is like, aha, you thought you could escape me. I have found you. I am coming to destroy you. Trying hard not to do a Dracula voice there. Kind of want to do that, but I didn't. So that's a way in which we can use that metrical feature to reinforce the sort of invisible worm state of mind or feeling as it locates and targets its prey. We should also consider as well, I don't think it's any accident, the last word of this poem is destroy. I am by no means a gardening expert, but I at least know that when a fly or some kind of parasite, a green fly I think it is, invades and it infiltrates a rose, the death of that rose is not instant. Okay, it is slow, gradual, and eventual. There's another way in which I think we can reinforce the sort of malice and the bitterness of this invisible worm. It wants to arrive in secret, so the rose can't flee. And I think he's enjoyed the fact that he's located the rose. Even more so, I think there's tremendous glee in the fact that the death and destruction and then death of this rose will be slow and gradual. Revenge is a dish best served cold, as that Shakespeare guy once said. So there's another sort of way we can interpret this and add strength to that wronged and bitter invisible worm seeking revenge on the rose that would not return his affection. It's quite understandable, really, now we're gaining an insight into what the worm is like, but there we go. Next up is our desire/sexual desire reading. Now, for me, this reading hinges on, or works on, a paradox and ambivalence. So the paradox I think at work here in terms of this sexual desire reading is that when if and when the invisible worm acts upon his physical desires towards the rose, actually destroys the life or the beauty or the purity of the rose or the lover he is attracted to. In terms of ambivalence, just a posh word for mixed feelings, but no harm in using some posh words here and there in English lit essays. This gives the worm/lover a dilemma. He desires this rose, but the act of having physical intimacy with it, allowing his sexual desire to manifest and appear and be acted upon, also has consequences. It destroys the beauty and the purity of the rose. Let's illustrate that with this little clip here. Okay, so there was a beautiful red rose. The claiming of it, which we're going to take into a reading of the taking of a virginity, perhaps. As you can see, the claiming of it is leading to, or heralds or begins, the destruction of it. If you snip a rose, like we've just seen, if you take it to sell it in a florist or to give to a lover or whatever, the process of its death has begun. You've severed it from its sort of source of life, and from there its life, beauty and purity will slowly deteriorate and eventually lead to destruction. So this interpretation then works on the idea of deflowering, which is a very old-fashioned term for the taking of virginity. Depending on how you view this, you can see this in two ways. One does not strike a blow for feminism and sexual equality. We have here the invisible worm, gendered as male, which is concerned that once he takes the purity and the virginity of this rose, then she begins to deteriorate and die. So in essence, she'll slowly stop becoming desirable because he's taken what he wants and indulged his passions and his physical lust. Or you can see it in a slightly more complementary way to the invisible worm, where he has this dilemma we mentioned earlier, this paradox where he desires the beautiful rose, he has physical lust towards it, presumably wants to act upon that, but then worries that I have transformed and changed the thing I love and desire by acting upon my desire. So she will stop being pure and beautiful then, once I have sullied or snipped, if you like, going back to that image earlier, or claimed or taken the virginity of the rose. In terms of AO2 stuff then, so we are looking at our invisible worm as a phallic symbol here, something that is penetrative and invasive, seeking out the bed, which obviously has a double meaning. We can look at in terms of a rose bed, but also in terms of the bedroom, I'd suggest as well. Crimson Joy, then, in the second stanza, links with this idea of taking a virginity, and bizarrely, years ago, it was a marriage custom to display the sheets of the bed from the wedding evening to prove the bride was a virgin. Dear me. Okay, so the idea of Crimson Joy there is the idea of that taking of the virginity. In some senses, it's oxymoronic. It's a clashing juxtaposition, particularly if you go with this idea of the dilemma or the paradox the invisible worm has. Crimson, if it's linking towards that idea of blood, is obviously to cause pain, but right next to that, in terms of the juxtaposition, is joy. So there's pain, which leads to pleasure, and I think that's giving the worm this ambivalence we've mentioned, these mixed feelings. Also, that, of course, as we've seen before on the previous slides and future slides, we have the ABCB rhyme scheme of joy with destroy. So now that is definitely lending itself to this interpretation of to act upon his imagined joy will bring about the destruction of the rose, with that clipping idea, with that claiming and taking of it. Just something else to add to that rhyme scheme as well there, we notice on the end of joy is that colon. Technical name for that is called a caesura, where you halt the flow of the line. We can do quite a number of things with that linked to this current reading. We can steer that into some kind of hesitation or pause. You can see that as a pre-coital pause, where he's maybe considering not enacting upon his desire, given the consequence of it, or as a post-coital pause, where he has this sort of unwelcome epiphany, really. Everything prior to this caesura, has been pursue the rose, claim the rose, satisfy my desire. Then there's the pause, and there might be the awful, moment of epiphany where, and his dark secret life does thy life destroy. So there's a very unwelcome outcome, or one that maybe has not been considered until after desire has been satiated or satisfied. So an interesting moment there in terms of the flow of the line with that caesura. Going back to the first stanza, we have that spondaic metrical stress and the opening two words, O rose. So we've got your spondy falling on those open-mouthed vowel sounds. So I'm maybe going to suggest there's linked to this ambivalence and this dilemma the worm has with this paradox, is maybe that idea of a lament, a sad, regretful tone that acting upon its desire has led or will lead to the slow but inevitable destruction of the rose. So the O rose definitely gets you giving you that mournful sort of lament sound of a tone and of regret. Going back to our place adverbial of in the night, well, given we've got the invisible worm as a phallic symbol, maybe that place adverbial in the night is referring to sort of nocturnal passions and thoughts, sexual thoughts that occur in the evening. Don't forget we've got in the night and bed there. The howling storm, the pathetic fallacy, again, now we're using that to maybe explore raging passions of the invisible worm's mood and sexual urges and desires here. Finally, those two adjectives we've mentioned previously, dark and secret love. With this kind of interpretation, dark obviously links to in the night, so something a bit sinister and evil. Maybe not so much evil now, but something that's maybe a bit shadowy. When it's followed by secret, dark and secret may be combined to suggest the idea of these were desires maybe best not acted upon, or should have remained dark and hidden and remained secret and not acted upon, given that we have that idea of possible regret here, where I've acted on my passions for about 6 lines of it, the caesura, and the last 2 lines where we have, oh dear, I've acted on my passions. Look at the consequences of that in terms of the thing I love. Okay, there's our kind of desire or excessive sexual desire reading. On to our next. Okay, with our plaguing thoughts interpretations, so we're going to be reusing a lot of the pieces of the poem we've used previously, but this lets us go in different directions, so getting ever more speedy here in terms of our rattling through these. So now the invisible worm becomes maybe a symbol of thoughts that jeopardize and ruin and destroy a relationship. So the invisible worm has found out thy bed. So the bed here could be the marital bed, so a place of sanctity, a place of togetherness, and that joy is going to be undermined and destroyed. So if we come back to the worm which is flying in the night in the howling storm, these can be doubts, such as doubts towards fidelity, doubts towards the integrity of the relationship. Remember I said earlier on the table I'm not 100% drawn to this reading, but I'm going to quickly rattle through it, and again it's one for you to evaluate. Personally, I'm not massively compelled by this, but it is our way, perhaps, of another way of seeing this poem. So we have his dark secret love, does thy life destroy again? So these thoughts again are dark and secret. Maybe these are those doubts that plague the relationship. They fly in the night in a storm, so we've got our ideas of tempest again, how in the night when things are usually quiet and settled, these are when these thoughts can lurk and arise and do their damage to the marital bed. So there's a very quick way of seeing the poem in a different sort of relationship sense. Again, I'm not massively drawn to that, but it is one to consider. Okay, our Edenic allegorical reading. Sometimes in allegories, it's often possible to see a moral being asserted or suggested here. Sometimes the moral can be overt and explicit. Sometimes it can be a bit more implied and implicit. I'll let you draw your own conclusions at the end of this. Okay, first of all, we can reuse our spondaic opening of O Rose. For me, that could be suggesting in this reading a tone of lament. A lament is to feel or express sorrow or regret for. And here I think it's a regret from what we've lost, which is essentially paradise and the Garden of Eden. Okay, so there's our opening we can sort of reuse here. The rose we're going to be looking at in terms of a symbol of Eden. Okay, so again, that's paradise for us that we had at first or originally, which becomes sickened and ruined and destroyed. Adam and Eve are evicted for transgression, for breaking the rules, for giving in to temptation, which becomes known as the original sin. So perhaps we're getting more of a sense of the moral emerging when viewed from this angle. So we have bliss and paradise, but somehow for mankind that's not enough, and the one thing we're told we cannot have means we lose it all. So you can see why I'm bringing up the idea of a lament or something elegiac. An elegy is something that again links to lament, a mournfulness for what we've lost. Okay, Adam and Eve or man aren't solely to blame for that, of course. There's a little matter of the next line, which is the invisible worm. So, invisible, we can reuse the adjective again for that idea of Satan lurking. We'll link this to dark secret love as well later. Maybe getting towards the idea that Satan, its love, its enjoyment, is basically to bring about the fall of man and to tempt man into sin. So there's that malice idea again, but let's be fair, this is Satan we're talking about, so we shouldn't be surprised by that, I guess. Linking to that is obviously in the night again, that's a clandestine, secret, lurking evil under the cover of darkness. From the Genesis story we get the idea of a serpent in paradise. So that is obviously the literal serpent in the story, but that phrase enters culture for someone, something, anything lurking with sinister intent to bring about the spoiling and destruction of enjoyment. So I don't know, you can have a serpent in paradise in your job if you enjoy your job and there's someone there threatening to undermine and destroy it. Interesting little phrase. The night and the storm again can be seen with that pathetic fallacy interpretation as a harbinger, an agent or a pre-warning of the destruction that's to come, which will be the eviction from paradise and the world, and cast into the world of man. We can reuse our spondaic emphasis again on found out. So again, that's adding to that idea of Satan's dark secret love, which is his enjoyment of targeting Adam and Eve, mankind, and leading it into temptation, sin, and being cast out from paradise. Don't forget, Satan itself knows what it is like to be cast out of paradise. He is a fallen angel. After saying non serviam, I do not serve to God, was evicted. So that's interesting in the sense that Satan has had that fate and now wants to visit that upon others. Misery loves company, it seems. Just picking up on the words bed and rose. Obviously, as a Romanticist poet, I don't think it's any coincidence we're getting the Garden of Eden described with natural, I mean of nature, not like natural opposite of fake, natural imagery or nature imagery. So Eden has a bed, and the other natural object here is a rose. So something that kind of gives pleasure, delight, comfort, a bed. It nurtures and supports, but also the rose making the paradise something of sensory pleasure and delight. You can look at a beautiful rose, you can smell a beautiful rose. So these are the things that we've deprived ourselves of by transgressing and being weak and giving in to temptation, even though we had a posh word here, plenitude and bliss. So everything on tap in Eden, but somehow that was still not quite enough for mankind. So yes, in a very romanticist way, we have those two objects from the natural world. Obviously, the Garden of Eden was a garden, so it obviously had greenery in it. But what I'm saying is that these natural objects are perfect for Blake to convey how and why it was paradise, obviously being a lover of nature as a Romanticist poet. Moving on to Crimson Joy. In Genesis, the chapter that has the Garden of Eden in the Bible, Adam and Eve, as we've mentioned, are enjoying the bounty of paradise, that plenitude, just bliss on tap. When they're evicted from the Garden of Eden, we're told that God makes their nakedness a source of shame. So in the image that we used earlier, I'll put it up again, you tend to see depictions of Adam and Eve with fig leaves covering up their modesty. So you could be looking at that again as that sense of lament and elegy, the joy and pleasure of being naked, not having that sense of shame. Is no longer available. You might be looking at me rather strangely here, but this actually links into something to do with William Blake. Allegedly, Mr. Blake and his good lady wife was once found in their garden, completely naked, wandering around, and whoever came into their garden obviously had a bit of a shock and said, "Why are you naked?" And Blake's answer to that was, "Oh, we're looking for fairies." Just going to leave that with you. So don't judge me by that. I think what I'm getting at is that William Blake sees the idea of paradisal nakedness and no sense of shame as a thing of joy that has been lost. Okay. Our interpretation of joy and destroy this time, again, could be that idea of that which we once had has now been lost. The poet and critic Tom Paulin calls The Sick Rose Paradise Lost in 8 lines. So Milton's massive, huge, epic poem, Paradise Lost. You can read that one summer, but not now because it'll take you ages. Paulin is saying that this is it in condensed form in 8 lines. I thought that was a nice little quote, but we don't need critical views for this part of the exam. Second to last thing, the dark secret love of the invisible worm. Now, our invisible worm here is Satan, so I'm open to other suggestions, but what I might suggest for now is that what is Lucifer's dark secret love? So I'm going to suggest that that is a love of leading mankind into sin and transgression. As mentioned earlier, Lucifer was evicted from paradise. It seems he enjoys having that fate befall mankind as well. So is there a moral here when viewed from an allegorical position? Perhaps it can be seen at the moralists for us to be ever vigilant for that which would lead us into sin. We're maybe looking at excessive desire again from a slightly more allegorical angle. As we said, Eden had everything, and yet in some mad 5-a-day craving, Adam and Eve wanted that apple, even though everything else was available to them. Okay, there's our allegorical reading. Second to last reading, going to go as quickly as I can here. We're seeing the same parts of the poem reused, but for different purposes. Let's try our revolutionary reading. So, this is a slight difference here in the sense that I'm going to suggest that viewed from this angle, the poem is quite actually happy or glad that an invisible worm is coming in to destroy this rose, given if we map that onto Blake's republicanism and his strong dislike of the monarchy and their world of privilege. So, O Rose, thou art sick. Our spondee here might be sort of sarcastic in tone. O Rose, thou art sick, oh dear. In the sense that these revolutionary ideas that are infiltrating the rose could actually lead to its eventual demise and destruction. So there's maybe a joy here in this secret and furtive journey into the rose by the invisible worm. Flies in the night, we can use this idea of sinister but welcome incursion into the rose. The howling storm, pathetic fallacy again. from this angle, very appropriate. Imagine an uprising or a revolution. It will not happen quietly, will it? That image of the French Revolution I put up earlier, there's cannon fire going on, there are castles being destroyed by cannon fire, there's the shouts of revolutionary freedom fighters, etc., etc. So this is the storm that's making its way towards England's shores. Not literally, but remember we said those ideas and ideologies. Has found out thy bed of crimson joy. So I think the bed here becomes symbolic of luxury and privilege. Depending on your view of the monarchy, of course, I know what mine is, but bed here might imply sort of an idleness and a laziness. What do they do all day? So, has found out thy bed. Oh, I'm sorry, did I wake you? I've come to evict you from your throne and kill you. This kind of thing. So, again with that spondee, there's maybe a delight here that this world of royal privilege is being shook up and is in jeopardy for the royals. Crimson joy, that adjective, I'm not alone in this reading. I think I've read something from that Tom Paulin again, who talks about crimson being a very regal colour. So crimson joy, again there's that world of privilege about to be disturbed and challenged, and maybe, hopefully, in the case of this poem and Blake's ideologies, overthrown. And his dark, secret love does thy life destroy. So the rhyming of joy with destroy here, again, is that revolutionary fervour. There's no lamenting here. I think there is a sense of hopeful, aspirational joy that revolutionary ideologies will bring down the monarchy. So you could reuse some of the techniques and features we've spotted earlier to tease out more of that. The worm and storm heralding destruction again that we mentioned earlier, but there's a way in which we can see our sort of more socio-historical way of reading this poem. On to our last one. Okay, lastly, we got there in the end, our Industrial Revolution reading. So, clear contrast here between the world of nature and the invisible worm, which threatens and seemingly does kill it and destroy it. So, O Rose, thou art sick, we can use our lament interpretation of that spondee again. The invisible worm that flies in the night and the howling storm. We're going to be looking at this in terms of a predatorial, sort of invasive presence. So England's fair and green lands are being rotted from the insides, leading to its eventual destruction by the impulse of capitalism and capitalists in the Industrial Revolution. So Wordsworth elsewhere talks about the building of railways and how they spew passengers into the landscape. So anything that spoils the natural world as God intended it is obviously frowned upon by Romanticists in different ways, of course, but that is something that arguably underpins a lot of their work. So invisible, again, there's something sinister lurking within it, wanting to hide its destructive intent. The night and the storm, we can talk about things like the industry and the sounds of mills and the sound of work to dig up and destroy and raze to the ground the natural world. Has found out thy bed of crimson joy and his dark secret love. So if we're looking at these two adjectives in this particular reading, there's that money is the root of all evil, a very biblical idea. Obviously the Bible frowns upon greed, but we are seeing this maybe like never before in terms of England's history, in terms of the Industrial Revolution. Vast senses of profit being made by capitalists within industry. And there is joy and destroy. So there's the joy of making money, of greed, of avarice, destroying God's green earth and the natural world which Romanticists hold so dear. And we are done. So, one rose, 8 lines, many possible ways of interpreting. Hope this has been useful.